Good afternoon, and welcome to the October version of the question and answer session with the Department of Cannabis Regulation. My name is Jason Killeen. I'm an Assistant Executive Director with the department, and we'll go ahead and get started with today's Q&A session. I just want to welcome everybody and remind folks that we already are in the middle of the 2024 license renewal process. The renewal cycle for 2024 opened on Saturday, September 2nd, and it will close on Wednesday, November 1st of 2023. This is the first year that licensees and every record with the status of local compliance underway must be renewed. So anybody that has an annual application record has achieved the milestone of local compliance underway and therefore are required to renew those records in order to stay in good standing with the department. And with that, we'll go ahead and jump into the Q&A session.
Good afternoon, everyone. We'll start with our first question from Ariella J. How can an applicant or licensee update the contact information and ownership on the LBER as part of the renewal application? And when will this functionality be running on Excella?
So the functionality currently exists within the Excella platform. Folks will have the opportunity to update their legal business entity record and the contacts on that in the very near future. Updating the LBER is separate and apart from the record renewal requirements that started in September and run through November. So any of the updates that are going to be tied to the legal business entity record can happen outside of the standard renewal process.
Our next question comes from Jesse F. When will the public convenience or necessity applicants be notified if they pass the land use review?
By the end of this week.
That was quick. Next question from Jesse F. Does the status of awaiting council determination on a PCN record mean that you successfully passed the land use review process?
No. So once we've completed the land use review, if you successfully completed it and you're eligible to pay the PCN fee, you'll be invoiced for the PCN fee, and then we'll start to move the record forward. Only folks that are past the land use review and then pay the corresponding PCN fee and submit their PCN application for council consideration will actually be moved forward for council processing.
This next question comes from two individuals with some other questions, Renee R. and Stephanie R. And it says, DCR sent a memo recently that the health department inspection and approval should be done before 12/31/23. License renewals will be granted. The health department process can take up to 6 months. How will this work? How will I get my license renewal?
So there may be some conflation in terms of the renewal requirements. Folks are going to have to demonstrate that they've actually reached out to the county Department of Public Health to begin the health permitting process. That's not going to be a requirement for this renewal cycle for the 2024 license, but it is a requirement during calendar year 2024 in order to renew for calendar year 2025. The municipal code has requirements that one, everybody has to have a public health permit, but specifically for the retail storefront businesses, they'll all have to have their emblem, which gets issued along with the public health permit by the Department of Public Health by 2025. So we're going to be requiring that people demonstrate that they have, in fact, gotten into the public health process and they are making progress towards getting their necessary public health permits and or the emblem. For this year, one of the things that may have been conflated is LA Public Health. They created a streamlined process to allow for people to go through a site evaluation in lieu of going through plan check and a site evaluation. And the county is going to be ramping down that program. And we don't know exactly when they're going to require everybody to start going through plan check and a site evaluation. But we do anticipate it will be around the end of this year. And if you do have to go through plan check and a site evaluation, the fees are about 3 times higher than they would be if you just had to go through the site evaluation. So we have been encouraging folks to reach out to the LA County Department of Public Health so that they could initiate this process and hopefully go through the streamlined process that, one, has fewer requirements and 2, has lower fees.
Our next question from 2 individuals, Jorge N. and L'Oreal A. Are you offering renewal fee waivers or offering any kind of financial assistance with the application for social equity applicants?
Not at this time. So there are no renewal fee waivers, and only the phase 3 retail round 2 applicants are eligible for fee waivers tied to their initial application. If more funding becomes available, DCR could provide additional direct financial assistance to social equity individual applicants, but unfortunately at this time we don't have any grant funding for that purpose.
Our next question from Eric H. and Sky S. Regarding the cannabis lounge space, what is the status of the Los Angeles facilitating consumption lounges?
So currently the city of Los Angeles does not have any regulatory framework for authorizing DCR to issue cannabis consumption lounge licenses. And a bill that was recently forwarded to the governor for consideration was actually vetoed by the governor over the weekend. So unless and until the City Council and Mayor adopt a regulatory framework for consumption lounges, DCR is not able to accept applications or issue licenses for that activity type.
Our next question from L'Oreal A. Are there any workshops or seminars for social equity applicants who are seeking a license?
So if you're a verified social equity individual applicant, you have access to the learning management system, and there's currently over 160 hours of self-paced learning, modules and webinars included in the LMS that you would have access to. And additionally, there's information and collateral materials on the department's website.
Lamont G asks, can I apply for distribution and manufacturing until verification applications are open?
Yes, distribution and manufacturing are not limited to social equity individual applicants, so any applicant can apply for those license types.
Rita Y is asking, is there an open period for applying for a cannabis license, or can we do it anytime during the year?
It depends on what the activity type is. So testing, distribution, manufacturing, those activity types are open and folks can apply for them at any point in time. For non-storefront delivery, social equity individual applicants that have been verified can apply for it at any time. And then for the retail storefront license type, we've been conducting lotteries for participation in that activity, and we don't have a lottery planned at this time, but we plan to do so in the near future. And then for folks that want to apply for the retail storefront activity in an area subject to a finding of undue concentration, we do have limited PCN filing windows that open up throughout the year, but one is not currently open at this time.
Thank you, Jason. Here's an additional question from Rita Y. Is there any possibility that we can buy or get transferred from an existing licensee?
There's the possibility that if you find a business that's looking to either sell their business and the licenses associated with it, or allow for other investors to come on board that you could become an owner of an existing licensee. But the department doesn't do matchmaking. So you would have to do your own research and see if there are any licensees that are looking to bring on additional owners.
Marty V asks, how do I apply for a Type 9 license? What is the approval timeline, and which counties are currently accepting applications?
So only verified social equity applicants can apply for a Type 9 license within the city of Los Angeles. And the approval is going to really depend on how quickly you navigate through our local regulatory requirements, but anticipate at least 3 to 6 months. And I can't answer for which counties are currently accepting applications, but the city of Los Angeles is accepting applications from verified social equity applicants.
Thank you, Jason. Linda D and Anthony H ask, once a pre-application review app is submitted, how long before the applicant can expect to hear something from DCR?
Generally 30 to 90 days. It really depends on whether or not the applicant is eligible for fee waivers or they have to be invoiced for the service. If they are invoiced for the service, they have up to 30 days to remit payment, and we don't start doing any type of review until a waiver has been granted or payment has been received. And then assuming that we don't need additional information or sensitive uses don't have to be further researched associated with the record, generally it's done within 30 days. And, if we need additional information like a premises diagram or a proposed premises diagram, or we're researching as to whether or not something meets the definition of a sensitive use as required by code, it could take an additional 30 to 60 days from there, depending on how quickly the applicant gets back to us, or we get the additional supporting documentation that we're looking for.
Our next question comes from Karen G. What forms are needed to transfer a license to a different location?
So currently a license doesn't just transfer to a different location. You have the ability to submit a modification request, and then effectively you would go through a modification process to create an application record at the new location. And once you've met the requirements for licensure at that location, we have the ability to either issue a license or make a recommendation to either the director or to the Cannabis Regulation Commission to issue an annual license.
A follow-up question from Karen G. What forms are needed to add new owners, persons, and entity to a license?
So you would have to submit a modification request against the legal business entity record for that entity. And then you would go through the process of either adding or removing owners and then submitting the necessary documentation to facilitate that new ownership group.
From Levon E, if location eligibility is good to move forward, does that mean the application is pending and has a spot on the map, or does that come after pre-app submission?
So if a pre-application record is submitted, that's just pending DCR consideration, and they don't actually create a buffer or a formal flag on the map. Even after a pre-application record is deemed eligible for further processing, it still doesn't create a formal flag or a buffer on the map until the application is actually deemed filed. So somebody who has a pre-app record that's deemed eligible for further processing has up to a year to submit their application. But until an application is submitted, corresponding fees are paid, and the application is deemed filed, a formal flag is not planted, nor is a buffer created from that record.
Our next question comes from two individuals. It has several parts. Please, Jason, if you need me to repeat any part, let me know. And it is as follows. Since the renewal cycle closes on Wednesday, November 1st, and if current licensees fail to renew, will those locations be freed up on the map before the December 8th deadline lottery? So that those selected can apply in locations within 700 feet to a current but soon to be expiring retail record.
So the simple answer is no. The general renewal cycle will close on Wednesday, November 1st. Once the general renewal cycle closes, licensees still have the ability to submit late renewals subject to the payment of additional fees through the end of the calendar year. At the end of the calendar year, the license for 2023 will expire by operation of law. And then the licensee still has up to the end of February to submit a late renewal. Any record that unless a licensee formally submits a modification request to relocate, or they cancel or withdraw that record, the location's not going to be freed up until the renewal process has formally closed, including the late renewals. The fact that they allow their license to expire could result in another licensee or application to be accepted or considered after January 1st of 2024.
Okay, the next question also has many parts. Again, if you need me to repeat, let me know. This comes from Donald E. and Sam P. SB 51 has now become law. How does it affect round 1 and round 2 applicants? What is DCR doing to reroute P3RR2 lottery applicants back into the provisional or temporary license process? And does it provide an avenue for lottery selectees to be granted a deadline extension?
So you'll have to keep track of the question to see if I hit the different points, but I'll do my best.
Okay.
So SB 51 was signed by the governor this month. The law in terms of the Department of Cannabis Control, which is the state agency, being able to grant new provisional licenses doesn't go into effect until January of 2024. So locally, we would have to work with the mayor and city council to amend the municipal code to grant DCR authority to accept new temporary approval applications or grant new temporary approval through the annual application process for folks that didn't originally submit a temporary approval application. So that's something that we will be working with the city council and the mayor on now that SB 51 has been signed by the governor, and we do have until January at least to get a framework set up for that. We have built in a mechanism for folks to request temporary approval through the annual application process. So for the phase 1 or the phase 3 retail round 1 and retail round 2 applicants that already submitted temporary approval applications that got migrated, they do have access to the temporary approval process, and to the extent they don't have an existing state provisional license, they may be able to pursue that state provisional license in January when the DCC has the authority to reopen that process or grant new provisional licenses. In terms of the December 8th deadline for the phase 3 retail round 2 applicants to submit their pre-application review record, that date is set by the Los Angeles Municipal Code. So again, the only way to extend that date for folks to get the benefit of SB 51 would be for the mayor and city council to amend the municipal code to allow for an extension of time. And that's something that the director is very supportive of. And she started to have conversations with policymakers on making those amendments. But again, the law will have to be amended, which will take an act of the city council and mayor.
I think you got to each part of the question. Thank you, Jason. Our next one comes from Christina C, and she asks, will a retail record with a not in compliance project not under review and not operational status disqualify a phase 3 retail round 2 lottery pre-application that is within 700 feet to a not in compliance project under not review and non-operational retail record?
So a pre-application review record will have a status of not in compliance, not under review, and not operational because we haven't accepted an application for that location. Those statuses get updated to the local compliance underway once an application record is deemed filed and we've received the necessary forms to begin the land use, the CEQA review or the environmental review for that particular record based on the activities that get filed as part of that formal application. So a pre-application record has no bearing. Those statuses on a pre-application record have no bearing on those statuses for another pre-application record. And again, pre-application records deemed eligible for further processing are not considered formal flags that create buffers. That doesn't occur until an application is deemed filed from that record. So DCR has the ability to deem multiple pre-application records eligible for further processing that were within 700 feet of one another. However, once the first applicant files the formal application and it gets deemed filed, it will create a buffer that will make the other pre-application record ineligible for processing at that time.
Okay, our next question comes from Anthony H. What is the current processing time for an LBER or legal business entity record?
Generally 30 to 90 days from the date that the fees get paid. And then it's going to really depend on whether or not the legal business entity record has to go through the equity share review. And that's limited to social equity applicants.
Our next question from Chauncey B. Why does the social equity applicant get a fee deferral instead of a fee waiver where the social equity applicant will not have to repay the fees?
Fee waivers are tied to grant funding and the availability of grant funds for that specific purpose. At this time, DCR does not have any additional fee waiver monies that can be granted. Therefore, the director can only at best grant fee deferrals when we have a pot of money that would allow for backing up those deferred fees with either a general fund appropriation or something else. So, anytime a fee deferral is granted, the party that is granted that deferral will have to repay those fees.
This next question also comes from Chauncey B, and she asks, why do applicants have to renew a pending license application when they haven't operated or even opened their business? Can DCR just charge an initial application fee and head into renewal provisional and/or annual fees once the business is officially open?
So the renewal tied to records that have a status of local compliance underway is to ensure that one, the record is maintained with current standards and information is kept up to date and they're submitting information, and two, that the business is still looking forward moving forward through the application process and pursuing licensure. We have a number of records that have been in the DCR process since 2018, where the applicants are not making progress towards licensure, and requiring people to renew records on an annual basis ensures that, one, the records are in the most current format for reporting purposes. We maintain all records with all of the current form requirements, and we know that the business is still pursuing licensure. We do not charge the inspection fees for records that don't have an operational status or a license. Those fees do get charged once the licensee meets the minimum milestones for the inspections. So we do charge the minimal renewal fee for folks that just have records pending versus the businesses that have reached operational status and have a license to operate.
Thank you, Jason. Jim T asks, for retail annual application, what other items are required beyond the requested paperwork uploaded to the portal and payment made?
So for the annual application process, all records are going to have to go through an environmental review. Once the record is deemed complete for the retail storefronts, we are required to do a community meeting where we're going to get stakeholder input, and then we'll summarize that. And then once we've had the stakeholder meeting or the community meeting, the DCR personnel will have to prepare a formal report that will be transmitted with the input from the community meeting, as well as the final environmental review report and the department's recommendation about the status of the application. And then that will all get forwarded to the Cannabis Regulation Commission. And then the Cannabis Regulation Commission would have to schedule that record for a public hearing and make a determination of whether or not the applicant meets the requirements to receive an annual license.
Our next question from Stephanie R. When submitting your renewal, can you submit a modification as well? For example, updating ownership.
The simple answer is the records, which are anything that ends in the -ANN. When you do the renewal, it's location specific and tied to the things that are unique to that specific record. For ownership changes, the owners, the primary personnel, authorized agent, that information is all stored on the legal business entity record, and that can be modified at any point. And it's the business's responsibility to go ahead and submit a modification whenever they need to update either the ownership or the primary personnel tied to the location. We're no longer requiring people to submit the same ownership related forms as part of the actual ANN record renewal process. It only has to be updated when changes need to be considered by the department.
Our next question comes from individual with the initials AS. If an SEIA lottery winner submits a compliant location on December 1st and does not get DCR approval of the location until January 1st, but loses its site control sometime in between December 1 and January 1, does the social equity applicant get to refile with a new location where they have site control?
No. So the code allows for a phase 3 retail round 2 social equity individual applicant to initiate the pre-application process by December 8th. If after December 8th, their location is either ineligible or they don't have an application pending before the department, refiling would not apply to them. Refiling only applies to records that have been deemed filed, which means an application has been accepted, fees have been paid, all of the necessary application documents have been submitted, that ultimately gets deemed abandoned at a later date. And loss of site control would be one of those reasons why an application could be deemed abandoned. But if an application wasn't before DCR, the status of the pre-application record and the lottery SEIA's ability to move forward at that location wouldn't necessarily trigger refiling. We would have to have an application actually pending before us in order for it to be abandoned and trigger refiling.
Our next question from Jenny C. Is there a website for indoor grower info?
I don't necessarily understand the question. DCR has a website that talks about the application types that we accept and the different types of cultivation licenses. And the Department of Cannabis Control has a website that provides additional information about their license types and their application process. But we don't post the locations of licensed cultivators or pending cultivator applications.
Let's see, the next question from Silvana M and Rabin W. When will DCR open verification again?
I don't know at this time. Unfortunately, just stay tuned.
And then Johannes V. If we do not pay for the current year renewal and do not operate in that year, the following year, if we like to resume operations, do we pay for the previous and current year or only the year we will be operating the license?
If you do not pay the renewal fees, your record will expire. Regardless of whether it's a record with local compliance underway or you have a license, it will expire at the end of the calendar year. The current code does allow for folks to submit a new record within 3 years of their license expiring. But if you don't have an active record or an active license, ultimately somebody else may backfill the location or create a buffer, or undue concentration could be reached in the community plan area, which may impact your ability to restart the application process when you're ready to, move forward.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Mike S. Since the new 4013 form was not published until days into the renewal period, will DCR be okay if I place a placeholder instead? Will this generate a renewal invoice so that fees can be paid prior to November 1st? Will the renewal record allow for additional uploads after the initial submission?
So it would not be okay if a placeholder gets uploaded. If an earlier version of the 4013 form was uploaded, when we do our review, we'll identify that we need additional information based on the new 4013 form, and you'd have at least a minimum 30-day cure period to provide the additional information. And if we still have questions after the initial 30-day cure period, staff have the ability to grant an additional 30-day cure period. But at a minimum, you better submit at least the old 4013 form that had some of the basic information so that we can start finalizing the environmental report for that particular record. And then, of course, we would give you some additional time to complete the new 4013 form and get the remainder of the questions out of the way. When you start the renewal process in the portal, if something gets uploaded, the system doesn't know if it's the correct form or it's the form has been populated and filled out. So you can trick the system into generating an invoice for you prior to November 1st. But please don't use placeholder docs and stuff because an analyst may, reject the record, which could subject the applicant or licensee to additional late fees because they didn't do what they needed to do by the initial deadline. So please submit the forms try to submit completed forms. And if there's missing information and other stuff, staff have the ability to grant cure periods based on the review and give you time to get completed and updated forms to us. But if placeholders are submitted, the renewal record may be rejected. The renewal record does not allow for additional uploads after the initial submission. Once the renewal is submitted, it's locked and it doesn't get unlocked until the analyst goes in and begins to review the information that was uploaded as part of that renewal record. And, if the forms submitted are deficient, analysts will give you an additional 30-day cure period at least to correct it. But if you do upload placeholders, you're not uploading the forms that are being requested and you're trying to trick the system to avoid late fees, it could result in the rejection of the renewal record.
Thanks, Jason. This next question comes from 3 individuals, Mike S., Ariella J., and Toby. Regarding the new 4013 form, do we need to fill out all the class sections or just the exemption class that we fall under?
You need to fill out all of the class sections. So the updated 4013 form was built around conversations that we had with the Department of Cannabis Control and what their analysts expect when you give them a completed environmental review or we file a categorical exemption. So we do need to provide, as part of our written report, responses to all of the various class sections so that when you do take that final report to the state, they have everything that they need to complete their review, and then they have the ability to determine whether or not they concur with DCR's recommendations for that specific exemption. Please complete everything.
Ariella J. also asks, when submitting the current premises diagram as part of the renewal application, will licensees/applicants be required to pay the premises modification fee? If yes, is that for any diagram modification or only for certain ones, such as those over 2,500 square feet?
So it's going to depend on the status of the record. If modification fees would be applied, the analyst will reach out and let you know. It's really going to depend on whether it's a pending application with local compliance underway or it's a licensee that is doing amendments, and we'll see those amendments and that premises modification as part of our compliance inspection going into 2024. For modifications that are less than 2,500 square feet, that could be done as a business premises modification. But if it's over the 2,500 square feet or 10% of the existing footprint, that would be considered potentially a relocation, and we'd have to do another land use review to make sure that the modification on what's being proposed doesn't put the business footprint within either 600 or 700 feet, depending on the activity type of a sensitive use.
The next question from Wendy W. Asks, can you provide a brief overview of CEQA and the exemption?
If somebody from our team could just drop the links to the prior webinar that we did last month, I would appreciate it. We did a pretty comprehensive overview of the California Environmental Quality Act, which is CEQA, and the Form 4013 process. But in a nutshell, commercial cannabis licenses within the city of Los Angeles are considered discretionary permits. As such, DCR has to conduct an environmental analysis under CEQA to determine whether or not the project is exempt, or an initial study and an additional analysis would be required. Part of that determination is that 4013 form that we've discussed as part of this Q&A, where there's basic questions and information we have to gather to determine whether or not a proposed project could qualify for an exemption. And then for projects that don't qualify for either a statutory exemption or a categorical exemption, the applicant would have to pay for an initial study to collect additional information to see what type of analysis would be required under CEQA. But I would refer you to the websites and the webinars that we've conducted if you would like more in-depth information.
Thanks, Jason. Our next question comes from Mohammed R. How many retail type 10 SCIA applications can an entity, in parentheses, investor partner with a 20% or higher ownership be part of?
Persons are limited to an ownership stake in 3 retail licenses, regardless of whether it's the retail storefront type 10 or it's the retail storefront type 12, which is the local micro business retail license.
Our next question comes from Sylvia F. If there have been DCR updates to required forms, for example, one version of the LIC 4010 form excludes a radius map. After a form has been submitted, if there is a change, will DCR independently notify the applicant about the new form?
The simple answer is yes. So once we've gotten the records through the renewal process into the 2024 record type, staff will be going through the records to determine whether or not they can be deemed complete based on the annual application requirements. And of course, if we need an updated form or something for it to be deemed complete as part of the annual application process, your analyst will reach out to you and let you know.
Our next question also comes from Sylvia. What are the requirements to pass a retail location inspection?
The requirements to pass an initial inspection for temporary approval are available on the department's website. And then, of course, the requirements to obtain an operating permit are going to be a lot more involved and in-depth and would come after DCR grants an annual license, but they'll also be posted on the website when we get into that process.
Ivan D and Christina L ask, when the next PCN process opens, will DCR give applicants reasonable time to find a location? The last PCN process allowed for a short time to find a location.
The goal is to standardize when the PCN process will open so that it opens up twice a year, basically in 6-month intervals, so that we can complete soup to nuts one PCN process before we reopen it for the next process in the cycle. We anticipate that the process would reopen sometime in the first half of 2024 once we've completed the fall 2023 version of the PCN process.
And then Ivan D is also asking when the process will open up again.
We don't have an open date scheduled for the next PCN process yet. You can sign up for updates through the website or keep an eye out on our website. And, as soon as we finish the current PCN process, we'll look to schedule opening up a new PCN process.
Christina L is asking, has any community plan areas opened up for the next PCN application process since the lottery?
At this time, we still have the same 5 community plan areas subject to a finding of undue concentration. The next time we open the PCN application process, we may have additional community plan areas subject to a finding of undue concentration, which would allow prospective social equity applicants to apply for a PCN finding in those community plan areas. But we'll post the list once we know when we're going to open up the next application process or filing period. And, we'll try to give folks as much advance notice as possible.
Our next question from Robin W. Can an SCIA retail operator acquire a testing license? And if so, how?
So at the local level, a retailer may not apply for a testing license as part of the same application process. Separate records could be submitted at the local level, but you would have to reach out to the Department of Cannabis Control to see if they have any restrictions on retailers also holding a testing license, either at or at a different location.
Lynn H asks, how can I find when the annual licensing hearing for a cannabis shop is scheduled?
We'll post the information on the department's website when we actually get to that point in the process. At this point, none of the records have been deemed complete, so we haven't started to do any noticing for community meetings or public hearings.
Chris M asks, does a retailer have to get a fire inspection?
Retailers are required to comply with the fire code. If you have a question of whether or not you're going to have to apply for a fire permit, I would recommend reaching out to the Los Angeles Fire Department and their Fire Prevention Bureau.
Our next question from Chris M. At what point can an applicant schedule their DCR cannabis inspection?
So so for folks that had submitted a temporary approval application, you could request an initial inspection once your application is deemed complete. For folks that are not eligible for an initial inspection because they're not eligible for temporary approval, you wouldn't be able to request your inspection until after we've made the determination to issue you the annual license.
Luis R. asks, we have temporary approval and are planning to make an ownership change. Can we do that during or after the annual application? And can you explain the steps?
So you can submit ownership changes or modification requests at any time. You would submit the appropriate modification type against your legal business entity record. And the processing of the modification will have no bearing on your ability to renew the record and location specific information that would be tied to the license.
Luis R. has an additional question. Are SCIAs able to combine ownership interest to meet the minimum requirements under the current law? Does this apply to new applications and or existing tier 1 and 2 licenses?
So the code does allow for social equity individual applicants to aggregate their ownership stake to meet whatever the minimum requirements are for the record to comply with 10420. The code does allow for aggregation with new applications and existing records. So pending applications or licenses, to the extent that you need to make that type of change, you would go ahead and submit a modification against the legal business entity record, where you would be aggregating that ownership.
Thank you, Jason. Manuel D asks, can you go over the current application process and timeline and at what point can you begin to operate?
So the general application process will take 3 to 6 months, and you initiate that process by going through, requesting a business tax registration certificate from the Office of Finance, creating a legal business entity record, submitting a pre-application record. If the pre-application record is deemed eligible for further processing, you have the ability to submit an application. In terms of application processing, at this time, we're not accepting any new temporary approval applications. So you would have to go through the full annual application process before you would be granted an annual license. And then you would have to pass a final inspection and obtain an operating permit before you would have a documentation that would allow for you to operate based on DCR's authority. You would also have to navigate through the Department of Cannabis Control's application process and receive a license from them, as well as pull any necessary building permits, fire permits. Every licensee is required to have a public health permit tied to their licensed activities, and those are all prerequisites to requesting the final inspection and pursuing your operating permit. We do have kind of a licensing 101 webinar or series of webinars that are available on the department's website, that you can look into and review to get more detailed information.
Thank you, Jason. Our next question comes from John L. If a pre-ICO licensee lost a lease and wants to move one building over, but the permanent supportive housing built within 600 feet of our current location and the proposed new location, does this now existing sensitive use prevent the move?
In order to move, you would have to submit a relocation request. And in reviewing that relocation request, DCR determines that there's a sensitive use within X number of feet of the location that would preclude us from issuing a license. Yes, it would prevent you from doing a move.
Thank you. MS asks, please define the term new construction in regard to the new 4013 form. Is new construction different from tenant improvements?
New construction is different from tenant improvements. New construction is looking at new buildings or fixtures that would be put on the parcel where you're pursuing the license. Separately, tenant improvements are generally considered to be things within the existing building footprint that you're updating for a variety of reasons. Tenant improvements are not considered new construction in most circumstances.
Jason, I wanted to check on your time. It is 12:54. We have maybe 7 to 9 questions to go.
Let's try to get through as many as possible by 1, and then I'll see if I can push back my 1 o'clock to buy us a little bit of time, but I may only be able to get like an extra 5 minutes at most.
Okay, just wanted to check. The next question also comes from MS. If we answer no to a question on the 4013 form, do we need to cite sources of information?
It really is going to depend on the question. That the more information you provide the easier it will be for your DCR analyst to prepare the environmental report that will go to the director or to the commission for consideration. So if you know the answer is no to, are you anything related to like stream beds, to the extent that, you don't actually produce any wastewater or anything that would go into a stream bed because the location is fully serviced by the Department of Water and Power, and wastewater goes into the sewer system for the city of Los Angeles that's maintained by Bureau of Sanitation and the Department of Water and Power. You state that because that's more information that can be included in the environmental report. The fact that you're citing something or giving us additional information does help us prepare more comprehensive environmental reports, which ultimately should help you navigate both through the local process and the state process a little bit more smoothly. Otherwise, the analyst may have to look up the information to determine why you answered a specific way to a specific question. For the 4013, more information is better.
The next question from Toby, what is the criteria for CEQA exemption petition? He's citing page 17. How do we get an exemption approved?
So as part of the California Environmental Quality Act, there are statutory exemptions and categorical exemptions that a jurisdiction may make findings for, provided that the project meets whatever those exemption requirements are, and they don't trigger any of the things that would exclude a jurisdiction from utilizing a categorical exemption. So there's a series of questions where if you answer yes, it will preclude DCR from considering a categorical exemption for one or more of the classes, because the answer yes to that specific question prohibits us from using a categorical exemption regardless of what the other answers are for that project. Alternatively, if none of the reasons that would prohibit us from using a categorical exemption are triggered, then we actually have to go through the individual questions for each of the categorical exemptions to determine whether or not your project meets the requirements for that exemption type. And folks can ultimately, you're hoping that your project qualifies for at least one categorical exemption, but projects may qualify for more than one categorical exemption. Again, I would recommend going through the DCR website and finding the webinars, what we've done tied to the CEQA process, as well as the updated 4013 form, so that you kind of have more information about how to fill out the form and what types of questions will be answered or asked of you that you'll have to answer.
Thank you. Philip is asking, I have had a phase 1 environmental site assessment completed on the property. Does that meet the requirements of a CEQA evaluation? If so, do we upload a PDF file to the annual application?
So the simple answer is no. It doesn't meet the requirements for CEQA evaluation as it relates to the DCR process or the Department of Cannabis Control process. The only way that you'll be able to meet that requirement is for DCR to prepare an environmental report that will go along with the staff recommendation to issue an annual license. Ultimately, once the decision maker has adopted those findings, for projects that do qualify for a determination of categorical exemption, once the NOE is filed and the appeal period closes, the Department of Cannabis Control would consider the environmental findings final, and they would be able to utilize them for their process. If you've already done a study, you can upload that to your annual application, and it could supplement the 4013 form that we require all applicants to fill out. But in and of itself, it doesn't meet the requirements for a CEQA evaluation for our purposes or the state of California's purposes.
Let's see, our next question comes from someone with the initial A. If a PCN application does not pass land use review, what is the process for submitting a new location for the PCN pre-application?
You'll have to wait until the next PCN filing period to submit a new PCN pre-application record. MS asks, what is the proposed use? Oh, I'm sorry. Let me just double check your time. It's 1:01, Jason. Let's go for another 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. MS asks, what is the proposed use when a location has multiple commercial activities? For example, retail storefront, retail delivery, cultivation, manufacturing, and distribution.
So it's all going to be record specific. So any of the licenses that the applicant is pursuing should go under the proposed use. And you want to identify all of the commercial cannabis activities that are tied to that record or may ultimately conducted in conjunction across multiple records. So if you had a phase 2 applicant that had cultivation, manufacturing, and distribution, you're going to want to highlight those. And if they've submitted a separate record for non-storefront delivery, you'll want to identify that record so that when we look at the environmental for all of the activities that'll be happening at that location, we can look at everything together in totality and then use those findings for both records because it's comprehensive. So again, more information is better for our purposes.
MB asks, if we are receiving 2024 renewal invoices less than 30 days before the 11/1 deadline due to a system error, do we still have a hard deadline of 11/1 to remit payment, or will we be assessed a late fee if we do not?
November 1st is a hard deadline set by code. So if the renewal is not deemed submitted and the fees are not paid by November 1st, you will be subject to additional late fees. Again, the 30 days for the general invoicing period does not apply for the renewal process. Those are all set by code.
MB asks, do entity records need to be renewed each year?
They do not have to be renewed. However, folks that do have ownership changes, primary personnel changes, have the ability to submit modification request at any time throughout the year so that we can consider those changes and approve them.
I'm going to try this one last one. Where do I find the number of spaces available in each community plan area on the DCR website?
We're going to be publishing a separate page to talk about the PCN process and the community plan areas and which ones have capacity. And that page should be posted in the coming months.
Thank you, Jason. We're going to stop there just to be cognizant of your time and your meeting. Thank you so much.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in today. And I just want to remind folks that our next Q&A virtual lunch will be on November 8th at noon. So look forward to talking to people again and answering your questions. Have a great day.